Now, Reverend Meeks asked me to come this morning and speak about black history. He knows that one of the things that I deeply enjoy and appreciate doing is talking about the dilemmas of black folk in America. That comes from my mother, who used to sit and read to me from the Bible when I was a young man. And I used to sit and watch her cry and soak her feet at night, because in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, she had to work in a tobacco factory where she'd stand up all day long and stem tobacco until her fingers would bleed. She would come home and soak them. And I would sit there and cry with her. And I would say, one day, I want to be like Samson out of the Bible and go back and fight for black folk to correct these kind of conditions for black folk in the land. So there won't be any more black mothers suffering like my mother suffered. And so what I did, I tried my best after being in politics and all levels of politics for a number of years, being in the White House with President Carter, being over education for the state of Florida, being the black first assistant secretary in the United States Department of Commerce, and being over a board of governors, chairman for a board of governors. I said I must bring all my intelligence and experience to bear to see if I can solve some of these problems for black people in this country. And so the first thing I did, I wrote a book called Black Labor, White Wealth, to define the problems for black folk in America like it's never been defined before. It ain't about all this stuff about personalities. It's about what are the conditions that precipitated black folk getting into this dilemma. And what black labor, white wealth did, it tracked 800 years of history in very systematic terms to show you every strategy, every technique, every law, every public custom, and every public policy that was used to enslave black folk around the world and to maldistribute almost 100% of all this nation's wealth, power, resource, privileges, businesses, and controls of all levels of government into the hands of the dominant white society. And what slavery and Jim Crow segregation did with black folk, it intentionally maldistributed all the resources away from black folk and created a real-life monopoly game. Black folk in America are playing in a real-life monopoly game that you're totally ill-prepared to play and win. And if you know anything about monopoly, monopoly is based on everybody sitting down and getting a fair share of the resources, the money in their hand before the game starts. Black folk, you can't play because you never got your 40 acres and a mule. You're sitting and playing a game that you're not going to win. And if you know anything about monopoly, the primary principles that go around the board and take the money that you have and buy land and buy the best land around the board. And if you can't buy land, then you buy businesses like electric company, the railroad, and the water company. And you buy your land, and when you develop your land, you put houses on it. And once you could receive enough rent from people landing on your houses, you then take your money and buy hotels. And then after you buy the hotels, you sit there and wait for all the rest to come around and land on your property and bring some wealth and power home to you. And see, my people have been playing real-life monopoly with no money, going around the board hoping the world that they can land on free park and income tax and charity. And when you play that kind of a game in real-life monopoly, sooner or later you're going to land on the wrong property. And when you land on the wrong property in monopoly, you got two choices. You either go to jail or you go bankrupt and get out of the game. And black folk are playing in a real-life monopoly game. And I wrote Black Labor, White Wealth to tell you exactly what the game was and how you're not playing it right. And then I followed that up with another book called Powernomics, says now that tracks and picks up exactly where black labor, white wealth left off. And I'm delighted by the fact that black folk took that book, Black Labor, White Wealth, and went to Geneva, Switzerland, and filed for reparations around the world. And that book then sets the premise of what your problem is in America. In America, your problem is simple. You do not own and control anything of wealth.
In the game of Monopoly, player starts with equal resources, and the goal is to accumulate wealth by purchasing properties, building assets, and changing rent into others. Dr. Anderson points out that in real life, black Americans have not been allowed to participate in this game on equal footing. White Americans are the historical beneficiaries of economic systems like slavery, segregation, and discriminatory policies, which have been able to accumulate wealth and resources over centuries. Black Americans, meanwhile, were either excluded from the game or allowed to enter after only the most valuable properties were already owned, limiting their chase for economic success. That explains the idea of the marathon. Some people start way ahead before of others, explaining why catching up between black people and white people will be a little bit difficult. But yes, Dr. Claude Anderson, with one of his talks in regards to Powernomics, usually uses metaphors to describe the things and to explain the economic situation, the economic dynamics between blacks and white America. Now, we've known for the longest time that United States was built by the sweat, by the blood of black people. And this is most known to American blacks and generally everyone in the United States, unless a baby who is born today or who is born right now doesn't know. But ask 7 years old child, 8 years old child, they'll tell you they know some part of the history, unless the school ignorantly doesn't want them to know. Now, Dr. Claude Anderson analogy, white people playing Monopoly games while blacks are the buyers, stems from the critique of the historical systemic economic disparities that have shaped the black community's position in the US economy. Now, there is one thing that I want us to note. I want us to listen to his speech. It is really, really important that we get to see the other side of the story. It is important that we get to understand, the Powernomics. We get to understand why Dr. Anderson is trying to explain black excellence to everyone, why it's important for us to know that we are so way greater. To see any African American or black American who have acquired wealth, like something that they can consider wealth, they are amongst one of the most hardworking people. Because as you know, the economic situations in the United States today, it's so hard. Now, Dr. Claude Anderson is here to explain and to shed light on these factors: power, economics, how or where has black people gone wrong, where did this system start, and how can black people salvage themselves from this predicament. These are presented generic stories. I want us to watch this video, and then, as you usually know, I'll be back with my commentary. And you know how we do it. Hey, just a simple request. If you wish, just if you wish, you can check my Cash App on my bio. You can join my Patreon. I'll definitely appreciate the service that you gave me. Until then, let's dive right into the video. I'll be back with my commentary.
Wealth and resources. You do not own and control anything more than 1/2 or 1% of anything important in the society. And yet, by the same token, you're bearing 600 to 800 times your fair share of everything that's bad. And consequently, we cannot play and win, and people wonder why black folk live the way they do, why every black neighborhood looks like Beirut bombed out. It's that way because we do not own and control any resources and never have. And so in Powernomics, I said, if you're going to play the game, here is a book that I've systematically analyzed all the conditions around the world with all of my experiences, not only in government and in education, but also as a safety and survival engineer for the Marine Corps, where I had to try to deal with our prisoners coming out of POW camps. Here's how you play the game and win in Powernomics, the national plan to empower black folk. That book and all those books are going to be in the rear room and for you to purchase this morning. But most importantly, the third book that I wrote was called Dirty Little Secrets About Black History, Black Heroes, and Other Troublemakers. And I've written 2 of those books. And the purpose of those books are to tell you that you are special people, very special people as black folk. That absolutely nothing has happened in the last 400 or 500 years that black folk did not either directly were involved in or indirectly did not cause. You were the engines that drove civilizations around the world for 300 years. You as black folk are not guests in America. You are not guests on this earth. You walk on sacred ground paid for by the blood, sweat, and tears and suffering and sacrificing of millions of black people. They paid for you to walk on this earth with your head high and to be proud. All the blacks who shine shoes and wash clothes and wash dishes and pick cotton, you all deserve to have a better condition on this earth. And dirty little secrets tell you why you're special people. And later on in my discourse this morning, I'm going to point out the three things I'm going to talk about. First is the state of black America presently. Second thing is how we got into our dilemma. The third thing to tell you that you are not only special people on this earth, but you've always had a special relationship with God that no other people have ever had. And all of that is embedded in the one thing that you keep running away from, and that is your blackness. Your blackness is power. The most powerful thing on this earth is your blackness. And you got to understand by the time I finish today what power and blackness there is. And unfortunately, we've never used it. We've been too much like the biblical scriptures in Matthew 26 that talks about 14 through 30, about the 10 talents and the 3 slaves. And we have tended to be like that third slave. When you had a master in the Bible that took and gave wealth and talents to 3 slaves, and he went out traveling in a distant land, and when he came back and asked for a report on what they'd done with the money, the talents that he'd given them, the first 2 told the master, here's what I got now. I've invested what you gave me. I invested the talents and the gifts that you gave me, and I have multiplied it. I've doubled what you gave me. The third one, when he asked him, what did you do with the money I gave you and the resource and talents and the gifts? He said, I didn't do anything with them. I buried it because I was scared to use what I had, the gifts and the talents you've given me. That reminds me like of black folk that I don't want you to be like that anymore. To hide the talents and the gifts that you've been given. And the master said to the third slave, get away from me. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to take away all the talents and gifts that I've given you. And I'm going to give them to everybody else except you. And then I'm going to cast you into the darkness, into blackness. And so that all I want to hear from the future from you is suffering and crying and pain. And that's what has happened to us. In many respects as black folk, we've given up the specialness that we have as black folk in our black power, the power of our blackness and our special relationship that we had with God. And consequently, we are in a dilemma. And contrary to what anybody on earth tells you, I don't care whether it comes out of a black mouth or a white mouth, anybody on this earth that tells you that black folk are progressing is lying to you. In proportional and comparative terms, black folk are exactly where they were in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. You have not moved not one iota in 140 years. You were on the bottom in 1860, you're still on the bottom. You're still outside and underneath our system, our economic structure. I don't care whether they're boom periods or bust periods. I don't know whether they're good times or depression or recession. You're outside and underneath. Consequently, when whites catch colds, you're going to catch pneumonia. You're not a part of the system. And right now, as I said, in 1860, as an example, at that time, you had approximately 287,000 black people that were free and within quasi-freedom. They weren't really free, they were quasi-free. They were not enslaved. The other 4.5 million blacks were still on plantations and in slavery. And those 287,000 black folk had successfully acquired one half of 1% of this nation's wealth in 1860 on the eve of the Civil War. I don't even pick in cotton or have their own little businesses or waiting on tables. They had acquired one half of 1% of this nation's wealth. And here we are, 140 years later, when you're supposedly free and gone through a civil rights movement, you still only own and control one half of 1% of this nation's wealth. You have not moved one iota in acquiring the most significant and the most important thing in our society. It is not civil rights. It is not integration that's going to give you equality and equal opportunity. It is what you own and control that makes a difference in your society. If you own and control nothing, you'll get nothing. There is no equal opportunity without having the equal amount of resources and power and wealth to be able to carry it out. And black folk at that time, as I said, had one half of 1%. Also in 1860, as an example to show you have not progressed. At that time, now check around in all the books that I've read all these years, almost 99% of all the black people in America were working at that time in some capacity, making money, wealth, power, income, businesses, and personal comfort for whites. And now I look around the society 140 years later in all of America, and still 98% of all black people in America are still working either in white corporations or some level of government, or working for other people, making money, wealth, and personal comfort for them. Only 2% of all the black people in America work in their own communities and their own businesses for their own people. The rest are still trying to be working in levels of government, federal, state, city, school teachers, and working for someone else. We only got 2% that can call themselves independent. Also, I looked to see what was happening in the 1860s versus today. I looked at all the prisons across the country documented in research. In Savannah, Georgia, in Atlanta, Georgia, in Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., I looked at the prison rolls. Even though you only had 287,000 black folk who were free, black people made up over 51% of the prisoners in 1860. Even though only 287,000 was free, the other 4.5 million still locked in slavery, you still made up 51% of the prisoners. Here you are today, 140 years later, as happy as you want to be, but yet still, 51% of the prisoners in the United States are still black. You talk about at that time, all those blacks who were out of slave, most of them couldn't even get jobs because of high unemployment. Because nobody wanted, they were either unemployed or underemployed. I look around across America, and now everybody on TV is talking about the possibility of losing jobs with the coming recession or depression. It's not going to impact black folk that much because you've always been unemployed and underemployed. Contrary to what you read in the papers every day and hear in the media, the unemployment rate for black folk is not what you keep hearing. You keep hearing that the unemployment rate for black folk is twice that for whites. That is a lie. That's one of the biggest tales ever been told. Unemployment rates in this country are decided based on two factors. One, are people who are actively in the market searching for jobs, and two, those who are receiving unemployment compensation. Black folk have a hidden unemployment rate in this country that is nationally, that is 35%. Now consider that in the context that even in the Great Depression of the 1920s and 1930s, the unemployment rate was 25%. But when the unemployment rate went to 25% in the 1920s, white societies considered that to be disastrous. And they committed every resource they had, every level of government, to get in there and bring down the unemployment rate. Here, black unemployment rate in America is 35% and nobody cares. You haven't heard one person talk about let's create programs and opportunities to bring down the unemployment rate for black folk that's fixed and locked in at 35%. And that's not the bad part of it. You go to most of the urban areas like Baltimore, the unemployment rate for blacks is 48%. In Detroit, Michigan, the unemployment rate for blacks in Detroit is 48%. In Pittsburgh, it's 49%. In New York, for black men, it's 51%. For black youth, it's 89%. You cannot make it that way. There's only 3 things that you can do to earn a living and be able to compete in the society. The only way you're going to solve the problems of the youth, you got 3 choices. You either got to get a business up here or have a job at the top. If you don't have a business and a job, you must go down to the second level. The second level is you must then go on welfare. Look for food stamps and handouts and charity. If someone comes along who's a conservative and they say, well, and they kick you off of welfare by cutting out the welfare programs, then your only other choice is going down to the next level. The next level is crime. You must go through either working a job and having a business, going on welfare, or going into the criminal rolls. You must do a combination, elaboration, or sophistication of those 3 things to survive. Unless you have some kind of magical ability to simply to evaporate and disappear. That's the only, you must do one of those 3 things. And now that black folk don't have any businesses, they don't have any jobs, you cut out the welfare rolls, and now you're amazed by why the crime is going up in your neighborhoods. The crime rate is going to continue to exacerbate and go up until somebody get enough sense, enough commitment to solve some of these problems that have never been solved for black folk. The first thing they should have done when you came before the civil rights movement started is say, what was the purpose? What was the purpose of slavery and Jim Crow segregation in the first place? Nobody's asked that and tried to resolve it. It did not happen by accident. Slavery and Jim Crow segregation did not happen by accident. It was intentionally inflicted on black folk. It was intentionally inflicted for purposes. And what was the purpose? To maldistribute all the resources and business and money and wealth into the hands of the larger dominant society. Now, how in the world can you keep talking about equality and equal opportunity when you haven't corrected it? You don't own and control anything, so what are you correcting? How are you going to have an equal opportunity? You got an equal opportunity to go down and buy a Mercedes or Bentley right now. If you don't have the money in your pocket, you go no place. And so consequently, we haven't resolved it. We are still stuck at that point. And we have not solved any of the problems. And we have not solved them because, again, we've not focused on the primary problems that we have in our society, which is how do you deal with a black people who are becoming a permanent underclass. If we don't solve these problems by the year 2010, I can guarantee you, as I predicted in all my other books, and every one of my predictions hit right on the money. By 2010, blacks in America will become a permanent underclass of beggars and criminals. If you do not solve these problems, as the conditions worse, if you do not solve the problems of trying to help the black community strengthen itself, you're going down. Now, and the first thing you do is understand what we should be doing. We should understand what the Bible said. Get knowledge, but more importantly, get understanding. Understand what you're up against. You're up against racism. Now, how did racism come into existence? Racism never existed on this earth. It never existed on this earth until the 1500s. You never had racism on the earth. Racism came into existence when 9 European nations, when Arab Middle Easterners and some Asians all of a sudden decided that they want to enrich themselves by building colonies in the newly discovered world, which was the Americas. South America, North America, and Latin America. They got into a contest. In the 1400s, Europe was decimated. It was being devastated by poverty, disease, famine, and crime. And Europe wanted to lift itself. And they found out that way back in 1442, when the Pope had been given by Henry the Navigator, given 16 slaves, and they'd used those slaves in the Catholic Church, very productively in the Catholic Church. So by 1488, Pope Innocent put out a public edict, says if you want to enrich yourself and move up, get yourself some slaves out of Africa. And so then all those European countries said that we can lift ourselves off the back of Africa and African resources and the African black labor. And so then all the European nations got into a contest, what you all call a race to develop South America, North America, and Central America. That's when the race started. And everybody was taking blacks out of Africa for about $15 to $20 a head and selling them in this country for about a 1,500% profit margin, for about $325 each. And they began to enrich themselves. And so racism started. Slavery did not create racism. Racism created slavery. And as we move through it, and slavery and racism are economic issues. They have, and I want to disabuse you of any misconceptions. It has nothing in the world to do. Racism has nothing in the world to do with getting along with people. It has nothing in the world to do with bias, bigotry, hatred, or discrimination, or prejudice. Those things have nothing to do with racism. Racism is a competitive relationship between groups of people that are competing to own and control resources and wealth and power. And once they acquire a significant amount of it, they then use it against another group to enslave them, to discriminate, to shut them out, and tell them who they can marry, whether or not they can go to school, or to maldistribute the educational funds for the schooling of another child. That's what racism is. It is a competitive relationship, and it's economic based. It started out as economics in the 1500s, and by the 1700s, it switched over and became a religious issue. It became a religious issue in the 1700s as the evangelical movement moved across America. And they wanted some justification for what they were doing to black folk by how they were enslaving. And so then they had, the Bible was modified. The King Edward version was modified. They started telling them to use certain scriptures in here to justify the enslavement of black folk. and to teach black folk, to use the Bible to hold some of them enslaved. And so that a slave would not revolt if he thought he was revolting against God. And teach him that he is to be obedient and humble and to work hard and be hardworking and to look for pie in the sky after death. And so that, and they used it. So at that time, slavery became a religious issue. And it stayed a religious issue all the way up until about 1859, 1 year before the Civil War, 2 years before the Civil War broke out. At that time, Charles Darwin wrote a book, or rather the scripture he calls The Survival of the Fittest, and the survival of the species. And what he did in there, drew some lineages saying if an elephant is bigger than a mouse, and a mouse is bigger than an amoeba, there's a vertical line between a tree and grass, and the highest is always superior to the lowest. And in doing that analysis, he says that since whites now, as a result of slavery, whites have acquired almost 100% ownership of everything, then obviously they are superior to black folk, the slave who owns nothing. And at that point in 1859, the issue changed then. From an economic or religious issue, it became a biological issue. And then after that point on, up until the present time, they started putting on your driver's license, on your birth certificate, what race you belong to. And at that time, see, the dominant society had acquired almost 99%, or not 100% control of everything. And so the dominant society was on a mountain, and black folk were in the ditch. The dominant society had received everything and controlled everything, the black person in the ditch. So what they did then, they took the word race, R-A-C-E. They took the word race, they cut the E off the end of it, and they stuck on a suffix. The suffix is I-S-M. I-S-M is a suffix that means maintain the prevailing conditions. Let nothing change. And they stuck ISM on. That's what racism is. Racism means that now that whites own and control everything and blacks own nothing, keep it that way. And that prevailed all the way up through the Civil Rights Movement in 1960, which means that anybody who accepts the racist philosophies, it's not about who's superior, it's about who owns and controls. Therefore, the philosophy is be conservative. Let nothing move from white hands to black hands. That is racism. Let nothing move from white hands to black hands. So consequently, the dominant society developed these philosophies that say, I'm opposed to reparation, I'm opposed to affirmative action, I'm opposed to set-asides and preferential treatment for black folks, because that would put them in a position to get resources and ownership and control. That's what racism. So racism is anything that will keep black folk from changing those conditions, from getting out of that ditch. That's the issue. That issue has remained constant. That's the same issue that you're going to run into now, whether you're talking about getting money from a bank or whether you're talking about the Obama campaign. The issue in the Obama campaign has nothing to do with Obama's qualifications. You live in our society now where white skin is associated and identified with meaning authority, wealth, and power. And you're smoking something that's illegal if you don't understand that, because it means that they're not going to let you put Obama in if they can stop it. Obama means that means if Obama goes in, you're crushing the white psyche in a sense of saying that whiteness no longer represents authority and power and wealth. And the other greatest fear they have is that if he gets in at that point, if he gets in, that means that in our country, symbolically, that the family that lives in the White House is known as the first family. Do you think in your wildest dream that all of a sudden this white country will say, now, although the first family is a black family, that's when them nigger families up there, and they're the first family. And then and Michelle sitting in the White House when the wife of the president is known as the first lady. Do you think, for an instance, that white women in this country are going to let a black woman be known as the first lady? And the issue right now between, whether it was with Hillary Clinton or now with Sarah Palin, the issue is not what you all could hear, and the issue is what we call genderized racism that goes all the way back to 1840s. Starting in the 1840s, when they started to get blacks out of slavery and an abolition movement started to eradicate slavery in the country. At that time, the women's issue jumped up in 1840s. And what they're saying is that before you...
Welcome back to the channel. Now, people like Dr. Claude Anderson, they're really, really important because it is from his book Powernomics, just as he said, made a lot of people to file cases. That they make them want reparations, you know. So it's important that we have people that really talks about this, and it's really, really important, and we really get to see the true depiction of the black plight and getting to know ourselves, because the black labor, the white wealth, it is like you working and I'm receiving at the end what you're working for. So it means that my potential resources are not mine. It's called labor alienation. Now, the labor alienation, black people were alienated from their labor. They didn't get what they worked for. Other people sat down like bosses are the one who got things from them. And you know, there are a lot of things that are associated with a lot of injustices that happened to black folks. Now, we might want to look at the historical context of this. Now, Dr. Claude Anderson reflects key moments in the U.S. history where black Americans were systemically denied access to wealth building opportunities. And it is in this way. Now, first, look back at slavery during the 1619 to 1865. For over 2 centuries, black people were enslaved and worked without pay, creating enormous wealth for white slaves owners and economic, particularly in agriculture. Slavery represented the first major form of black exclusion from economic participation. Yes, slavery was the first advocate for black exclusion from economic participation because, as I said, they were alienated from their work, they were alienated from their labor, they were alienated from their resource, right? Now, they are human resource, but they were alienated from the fruits that came from the work that they were doing, right? Now, I'm also going to be talking about Reconstruction and Jim Crow, which we are trying to date it from 1865 to 1960. After the Civil War, newly freed black people faced systemic barriers to economic freedom. The failure of Reconstruction, including the reversal of promises like 40 acres and mule, left many black families landless and without economic resources. Jim Crow laws further entrenched segregation and economic inequality. Black people were promised a lot of things after the Civil War. And the newly freed black people were exposed to systemic issues. They had barriers to their economic freedom. The 40-acre mule that they were to be given, the 40 acres and a mule that they were to be given, it was all a lie. Because why would you get that? And it is most known that if you get that, you'll be way ahead of white people. And that's what they were afraid of. So they didn't give black people a chance to also own, like to also have. You understand what I'm saying? So we really see where black people came from. Already they worked so hard for all these times, and they were promised after the Civil War and Reconstruction period, right, which happened in 1865 to 1960, that they'll get something out of it, but it didn't happen. The promise was all a lie, was all a deep, was all a dream. Another thing that I would like to talk about is redlining and discriminatory practices, 1930s to 1970s. In the 20th century, policies like redlining, where black neighborhoods were denied access to mortgages and credit, meant black families were barred from the wealth-building benefits of home ownership, which white families enjoyed. The result was dramatic disparity in home ownership rates, which is key source of generational wealth. True. We have white people who own homes, a lot of homes that they inherited from their great-great-great-grandfather, and some are still building on the same land. So the discriminatory practices that black people were never allowed to be homeowners. In the first place, how could they become a homeowner? They didn't even have a land. When they were lied about the 40 acres and the mule, it was all a lie, right? So it's not easier for them to own homes, like, because they were bad from getting mortgages that could help them build. They were bad from getting loans that they could use to make these things. So you understand how white people played Monopoly and how they made it successful, that they are the ones that are yet to benefit out from this, right? Now, I'm also going to be talking about discrimination in employment and education as another talking point of mine from the observation or from what I've seen. Now, even after the legal barriers were lifted, Black Americans continue to face discrimination in the labor market and in accessing high quality education, which further limits economic mobility. You understand that? So there's so much discrimination when it comes to education and the skills. So a lot of opportunities that came with these technocrats know how, it all went to other people because they couldn't do that because they were denied access to education. How about we talk about economic disparities today, like today? You know what I'm saying? So the economic disparities today, as a result of these historical injustices, the wealth gap between Black and white Americans remains significant. According to the 2021 report of the Federal Reserve, the median wealth of white household is nearly 8 times of that Black household. Dr. Anderson's analogy implies that in a game where starting positions were equal, Black Americans continue to face challenge catching up. The wealth, capital, opportunities in the U.S. economic are overwhelmingly controlled by white Americans, while Black Americans, despite being participants in the systems, largely remain consumers rather than owners or wealth barriers. Monopoly and power structure. Dr. Anderson's philosophy, as outlined in his book Powernomics, argues that power is based on ownership and control of resources. In the context of monopoly metaphor, the owners are those who control industries, business, and capital, right? While buyers, which are Black people, are those who must continually spend but own little. Anderson believes that this imbalance is maintained by lack of economic infrastructure. Within the Black community, where a Black dollar quickly leave the community and circulate in the hands of whites. It's a true sad story. Now, what are the solutions to Powernomics? I think it tries to also touch on that because it's an important part that I believe that we should always talk about. Now, solutions to Powernomics. Pooling resources. He encourages Black Americans to invest in their own business and institution rather than spending in communities that do not reinvest in them. That's purely direct. And it is true. And it is among the things that I've been advocating for the longest time. Now, the second thing is building industries. Anderson promotes the idea of building Black-owned industries, focusing on areas where Black people can control production, distribution, and consumption. Political and economic education. He emphasizes that importance of understanding the economic and political systems to effectively compete and participate in the economy. It's really, really important. Now, what do you think about this video? I will really, really want to know how you feel, how you think, about this because it's an important part of history that I feel like we need to talk about. It's really, really important if we just get to talk about this because these are things that affect us, these are factors that we live with, these are things that we go through. So, most definitely, I really want to know how you feel about this. These are presented Jinjuk Stories, and until then, peace, love, and harmony. Salute.